Great. I wanted to say again, just a tremendous thank you to Hila, Bimal, Shilpi, Dave, just everyone involved in putting this book together and creating this opportunity. It's just a huge amount of support in the drafting process, and then also just a really exciting opportunity to get to have this conversation with you all across sectors, actors, theory, et cetera. So this paper really is about a particular actor, recruiters. The title is Human Supply Chain is Global Value Chain, Employer Control in Nepal-GCC Labor Recruitment. And I'll briefly introduce just the overall paper, and then I'll go into some more detail about each component. So for over a decade, basically, scholars and activists have documented modern slavery of low-wage migrant workers in the Gulf cooperation countries. That's Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, among others. The documented practices that really lead to modern slavery of low-wage workers in the GCC include abuses that occurred during the workers' recruitment into those jobs, such as recruitment payments, misinformation, and coercion. And the recruitment process, is basically orchestrated by actors, migration intermediaries known as recruiters. And roughly 80% of low-wage migrant workers use recruiters in their home countries when they're trying to secure employment in the GCC. That often constitutes modern slavery, which really makes recruiters and the process through which workers are recruited really relevant to modern slavery. But interestingly, there's a lot of scholarship and a lot of activism on modern slavery in the GCC, very few studies on recruitment, and even fewer that include, interviews with recruiters themselves and really focus on the recruitment process, even as recruitment and its role in modern slavery has increasingly taken on new interest among scholars. And in looking at basically recruiters in driving modern slavery, a new set of scholarship has basically suggested that recruitment should be understood as a human supply chain, basically drawing on GVC concepts. However, there's actually very little empirical research that dives into whether recruitment can whether it can empirically be understood as a GVC, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later. So this paper and this chapter, I guess, is really presenting empirical qualitative research on one migration corridor to the GCC, which is recruitment of migrant workers from Nepal to GCC countries. And it really aims to do the type of empirical work on product supply chains through the GVC model that occurs in other sectors, and really apply that to migration. So that's the overall perspective, and I'll get into a little bit about how that analysis, has impacts on recruitment abuses that lead to modern slavery. So the first step, I guess, is to take a step back and just to look at the connection between recruitment and modern slavery. So there's three main areas that I can see where there are recruitment abuses that directly lead to forms of modern slavery, and what I identify in the paper specifically as forced labor and trafficking. So one is recruitment payments, which are often several times what workers would earn in the GCC. And to make it explicit, these are people who are, migrating across a really significant global wage gap. So they're aiming to earn much more in the GCC than they would be able to earn in their home countries. And that results either in a loss of significant savings because workers are paying these large recruitment payments, or often debt, which is often informal and at very high interest rates. There's also misinformation in the process about key aspects of an employment contract, such as where they're going, what work is going to be performed, the wage, and then also coercion, so coercive circumstances, again, that I'll go into a little bit later, during the signing of employment. Typically that takes the form of workers having paid significantly for recruitment, often having gone into debt, and then being in a situation where they discover the very last minute before a flight that the circumstances, the terms of work that they originally agreed to are not actually the ones that they have been, recruited for. And so there's a situation where the worker is presented with a contract that's not what they agreed to, and they have a question of whether or not to sign. And often because of the debt that they've already incurred, it makes sense for them to sign that, even though it's not what they otherwise might have consented to. So in these three, these forms of what I'm calling recruitment abuses, recruitment firms have a role, and that I'll go into in more detail in the case study, as well as individual agents. So typically globally in recruitment, recruiters are increasingly licensed firms that are government licensed, they're somewhat formal, but the individual agents that recruiters use to really find workers at a large scale. And there's a lot of literature and reasons for why they do this. Agents are often in workers' communities and have a degree of trust with them. And so that's a key way to sort of facilitate recruitment. Those individual agents are informal, basically. And despite the structure of there being a structure of recruitment regulation, for example, what I just mentioned of, at minimum licensing of recruiters, but what we've seen globally, a real expansion of regulation of recruitment, states do not effectively regulate these recruitment abuses either through national or international law. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So if you look at the destination countries, for example, GCC countries, destination countries typically argue that recruitment, which occurs prior to the employment in that actual destination country, is outside their jurisdiction. And then if you look at the home country jurisdiction where recruitment clearly falls, there's not either political will or effective capacity to recruit. One key driver of that is that home countries are often highly dependent on the remittances that foreign employment generates. And for that reason, they perceive that any regulation will increase the price of their labor on the global market, and therefore ultimately, not be in their interest because it's reducing the demand for their workforce. So that's the connection between recruitment and modern slavery. Now, because of that recruitment, what some people call a governance gap, where there's no real effective, regulation of recruitment, there's been, significant work to try and understand recruitment in the scholarly literature. But interestingly, it has some key gaps. So there's a lot of work, obviously, on low-wage migrant workers in the GCC, but no studies of recruiters themselves, and really only one notable study of recruitment, although it's primarily focused on, testimony from workers. There's significant research on recruitment in migration globally, but it really focuses on the role of recruiters as facilitators rather than the impact of recruitment on abuses that we would say lead to modern slavery. Then if you look at recruitment and modern slavery globally, this is what I was foreshadowing in the introduction, there are real studies of recruiters, but importantly, the framework is really of a somewhat basic business model of a firm. The firm has revenue, they have costs, and then on that calculation, they have a certain amount of profit. There's not a lot of GVC framing to understand the role of these firms, in a global supply chain, even though, that's kind of inherent to their work, because of course they are contracting with employers who are international. Now, Jennifer Gordon's new theoretical formulation of recruitment as what she calls a human supply chain is really meant to frame recruitment as a global value chain, with the benefit of understanding global recruitment, and then in particularly, coming up with some theoretical arguments that could result in hard law liability in the US for recruitment from Mexico to the US, which is the corridor that she's focusing on. But as she acknowledges in her paper as well, even as she's calling for the importance of seeing recruitment as a GVC, there aren't really any empirical studies with GVC analysis of recruitment. And she highlights in particular that, the scope of what we could do potentially with understanding recruitment as a global value chain really comes down to employer control. You know, as so many of you will know from other contexts of product supply chains, lead firm control, which here is the employer, is really important for understanding the power dynamics in GVCs. But that's something that in the recruitment context, because of the complexity, is not really able to be seen with the very, very limited empirical work that has been done so far. So that's where I'm trying to jump slides. There we go. So that's where my paper really aims to fill a gap. The two questions are, you know, can we really understand recruitment as a human supply chain? Does it have key features of a buyer-driven GVC? And here, what I've identified is at least like the bargaining power that we associate with buyer-driven GVCs, a real contract with purchasing practices, that reflects the bargaining power between parties. And then if so, to what extent are we seeing the employer control, like lead firm control over recruiters, if it exists, really lead to employer control over recruitment abuses that are then in turn leading to modern slavery? And the result, in theory, would be that we would be able to say that GCC employers, for example, who generally consider recruitment to be outside of their jurisdiction, in fact, are through a GVC exercising significant control over recruitment abuses that are happening in another country. There we go. So very briefly, I'll just go over the case study that I'm looking at. We're looking at Nepal to GCC migration. Very briefly, basically, GCC states are really the destination for the majority of Nepali migrants, and 80% again are migrating through intermediaries. Nepal has among the most significant schemes for regulation of recruitment, you know, maybe similar to the Philippines, as well as, you know, some other countries that heavily regulate recruitment. Basically, most importantly for our purposes, basically, in addition to licensing of recruiters, there's mandatory standards for the employment that would occur in the GCC or other foreign destination. There's a prescribed minimum wage for Nepali workers who are going abroad to work, as well as caps on the recruitment payments. And then there's a regulation of the recruitment process. So roughly speaking, another scholar, Jones, has really usefully broken it down into two phases. So one is pre-recruitment. So when a GCC employer is interested in recruiting from Nepal, the government looks at the proposed contract for workers and makes sure it meets a certain minimum standards. And then pre-departure for workers, each individual worker submits an application to the government that has to meet certain standards. They have to show a receipt, for example, for recruitment payments that matches the cap, before they are basically given gold, the green light to in fact emigrate. And of course, that's a really powerful power that the government has, because the government can stop those workers from flying. And I go into this in a lot of detail in the paper, but basically regulation at the national level is just not effective, despite existing. It's not effective in eliminating payments, misinformation, and coercion, which are the abuses that I identified as leading to modern slavery. So
Sahiba, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. So basically, the two questions I asked. GVC that's buyer driven, and then what are the impacts on recruitment abuses, resulted in two basic findings for me. So one was that there is effectively an informal contract between employers and recruiters. So employers are ensuring, basically employers have a lot more bargaining power than recruiters, and they're using that power to basically push down how much they're paying for recruitment. In addition, when they're also using that to push certain terms about how recruitment occurs, a particularly relevant one to mention here, in addition to cost of recruitment, is timing. So they're really pushing for very tight timelines for recruitment, which often mean that workers only are able to meet the recruiter, the more formal recruitment firm, once, right before they leave, which, as I document in the paper, can lead to situations of coercion. The worker, and in addition, the employers they set up the transaction so that they're only paying after recruitment, basically. So there's always an opportunity for them to be withholding, basically withholding payment after recruitment occurs if they feel that it wasn't done according to the standards that they set up. And that has significant impacts on recruitment abuses. I'll go over them very briefly. So one is, if we look at timing, when there's a very, very short time period for recruitment, that really incentivizes and encourages recruiters to use these informal agents that I mentioned before, who are a key source of recruitment payment rent seeking that really increases recruitment payments. They're a key source of misinformation as well. In addition, timing results, as I mentioned before, in really bringing workers to the recruiter at the very last minute, when recruiters have often paid a lot for recruitment and they're unable to, they have coercive circumstances of signing employment contracts that they have to sign before they go abroad. In addition, the fact that employers are pushing down costs, of course, implies that workers are paying the remainder of what recruiters, they're paying the remainder of employment, for recruitment. So if the employer is only paying 50% of the recruitment costs, the workers are paying the rest. However, as I raise in the paper, it's really the role of agents and that opportunity for rent seeking that is really, really driving recruitment payments to a point that can be really exploitative. So I'll stop there. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sahiba. Shilpi, you ready?
Yes, Bimal. Thank you, Bimal. Sahiba, thank you so much for submitting such an important, and it's a very inspiring piece of work. Thank you for letting me read the paper. It was fascinating. Also because, as you know, I live and work in the UAE, where we see all the time, but kind of overlook this inhuman working conditions of the construction workers. Truly, as you said, that the construction sector has a long way to go, in terms of corporate social responsibility and sustainability in the supply chains. It has attracted a lot of negative attention, but I don't think, the business regulators, recruitment agencies are doing as much they should be doing. I had few broad comments on a paper, and they're just absolutely comments, no suggestions here. I thought it's a great paper. First and foremost, your approach for understanding recruitment, it's fascinating, and so is your theorizing and conceptualization of recruitment. However, in several places in the paper, I found there is a little bit of a blur between the academic discourse and global and local efforts to address this issue of recruitment of construction workers in the GCC, and the blind eye, as I'm talking about, that government turns to the issue. So I thought that if you could just kind of little bit merge on that integration with broader GVC literature coming in, that might enhance the discussions there. I found it interesting that you borrowed the concept of buyer control from this piece of literature to explain the employer control in your work. Now, in this findings section, perhaps you might like to integrate this literature a bit more to explain the process of recruitment, or perhaps I would suggest if you can add another section on discussions here, which might enhance the paper more. One thing that was very intriguing to me was in all these examples that you had given, most of the sectors are, government sector, right? So how does that fit into the construction sector? Are there implications that they are similar sectors? They both function the same? I have got my doubts here. It's a completely personal. We can have a discussion about that later on. Another interesting fact that I thought could be picked up on the paper is the intermediaries. So Mendoza, you have mentioned Mendoza and who talks about intermediaries. Have a look at Munir's work, and have sent you the link as well. So Kamal Munir and his colleagues in 2018, they have a paper there which talks about the neglected role of intermediaries in linking global pressure with local transformations in workplace relations, that demands great attention. I thought that angle could also be very exciting in the paper, because you talked about recruitment, but not much going on about the intermediaries there. Another very important point I felt was maybe that could be a concern from the press side about the ethical concerns about your interviews, so they might like you to talk a little bit more about it in the methods section, because I didn't see those ethical concerns which has been addressed, in the methods section. About the new laws and policies, I would encourage you to have a look at the Labour Ministry of the UAE website. They have got a lot of new effective regulations coming there to prevent recruitment abuses. You might like to integrate that into the ongoing discussions there. And of course, something that Hila and Bimal has been talking about, COVID, its implications, and a bit of policy implications, I think also could be included here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shilpi. Sahiba, there are a few questions in the chat box. You want to have a look? I think one by Shamal,
That's great, thanks. And I couldn't see them during the presentation. And thank you so much, Shilpi, for those extremely useful comments. I really appreciate that and looking forward to engaging with them more. Should we go Yahel and then Shmuel, I'll make sure to read your comment because I think you're unable to use the microphone.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. It was fascinating and it was a pleasure for me to hear also the comments. And for sure, we need to talk. I'm also studying recruitment companies between Israel and Thailand on the corridor of this and agriculture labor migration. And from my view, from my empirical data, I would like to invite you to think and to comment about the idea that the recruitment firms is only one organization of recruitment, and actually a lot of players in the field are acting as recruitment, as you said. I mean, you did mention that, but I would like you to elaborate a bit more. And I think that the employer, I found out the employer received money from the recruitment company. The worker pays to the recruitment company, and the recruitment company pays to the employer for the right to recruit to them. So actually we see like a very complicated complex of recruitment, and also the worker themselves work. And for this, I'm sure you know, but the Saltenstein definition, they talk about the formal and informal ways of understanding recruitment and the way that they elaborate together. And this is one comment. And the second one is about the state, obviously. We are in the world that we already know very known pattern of bilateral agreements that tries to make an end for this abuse of recruitment. And to elaborate about that more, because we know that Nepal does have a few of them, even with Israel, I know from our case study. So what the states earn and does not earn, which places in the state itself benefit from the recruitment process. Thank you so much again, and I would love to be in touch with you.
I would love that as well. It would be wonderful. Shall I address that comment and then go to Shmuel? Is that okay? I'm not sure how we're running out of time.
Quickly, yes.
Okay. Very briefly, and then I hope we can connect more offline because it would be great to compare these. There is actually, so I didn't get into it too much in the presentation, but I also found that many recruiters are reporting that they are actually paying to companies for the benefit of being able to do business with them. And the way that I was looking at that is to say that regardless of whether that's the case or whether the employer is paying the recruiter, there's this transaction that happens after recruitment of a certain amount of payment, because there's often a return of some portion of that bribe or the opportunity or the promise of that occurring that creates the sort of potential bindingness of this informal contract. But it's in more detail in the paper. I didn't get to mention it very much here. And again, the informal-formal integration is something that I do feel is a major challenge in the paper, because I'm relying in part on the testimonies of recruiters who basically, there's a very small set of recruiters that do not seek to maximize their profit. And so they have a lot more control over recruitment because they do it more slowly, and they don't, they work with clients they've had a long relationship with and who often do pay in part for recruitment. And they were really highlighting that it is possible to, have a smaller and more regulated, privately regulated role for agents. And so to kind of make the agent's role a bit more formal, but only under the conditions where there's, a longer time for recruitment, where there is that bargaining power that recruiters have that in practice just does not exist across the market. It only exists for a very exceptional subset of what might be called ethical recruiters, but are also recruiters that have more bargaining power because they don't seek to get so much profit from recruitment. And bilateral agreements, yes, they are certainly in place in Nepal. I think it's possible that in domestic work, which is actually outside the study, they are playing a more significant role. I think in the GCC, there's a smaller role for them because the recruitment is larger and the regulatory interests of the state are a bit different. But again, I would love to connect with you offline about all of this. And Shmuel was asking, in relation of Nepal workers, well-known case, which is a well-known case, yes, in different places all over the Gulf. What can I say on the recruitment of Nepali workers by companies from the area of the Gulf on slavery conditions? If I understand, I think the question is about the overall conditions, like the employment conditions. And, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go into that in a lot of detail in the paper, in part because I'm trying to focus the discussion on recruitment compared to the conditions which have been discussed in detail in other works. But the idea is basically that a lot of the abuses, like recruitment abuses, misinformation, coercion, are creating situations that once workers arrive in the Gulf, they're really unable to bargain with employers to leave employment. They face tremendous penalties if they leave, for example, and those like a penalty, for example, or can basically lead to conditions of forced labor, and that as a result, when you take it together with the trafficking definition, can lead to conditions of both, forced labor and then often recruitment or, coercion into forced labor, which meets the definition of trafficking, roughly speaking. So there is a lot of connection between the two, and I've mostly used other work to explain that in the paper, secondary work.
Okay, Sahiba, thank you so much. I'm again. Any other thoughts, anyone, or should we just have a quick open house generally? Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.